afternoon. You're listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show, where we talk about extending the gardening season and pushing garden boundaries. We talk to creative gardeners and garden experts who share ideas about how to garden longer and grow plants you didn't think you could grow. To contact us live, send us an email. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. Now, here are your hosts, the daughter and father duo, Emma and Stephen Biggs.
Hey everyone, I'm Emma Biggs, and thanks for hanging out with us today on the Garage Gardeners Radio Show. I'm a 13-year-old garden writer and speaker who loves growing tomatoes. I'm an extreme gardener who wants the garden season to never end, or at this time of year, I guess, begin.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Biggs. I write and speak about the food chain, farms, food, and gardens, and I'm a fig pig. One of my favorite plants is the fig. I have lots of figs growing around my place here in Toronto, and lots of other out-of-zone plants too. It's the challenge of growing figs in a cold climate that helped me see how fun the challenge of pushing zone boundaries is. Now, Emma and I also think gardening's a great way to hang out together, and we're glad you're hanging out with us here today. Our show is all about extending the gardening season and pushing zone boundaries.
Now you're probably wondering where we got the name, the Garage Gardeners. Well, Dad and I use our garage to extend the growing season because I grow heat-loving plants like peppers and eggplant on a garage rooftop, and Dad stores his dormant fig trees in the garage over the winter. It helps us extend the season for growing and storing tender plants.
Now, we're giving away a fabulous book today. It's written by our first guest, Tara Nolan. The book is called Raised Bed Revolution, Build It, Fill It, Plant It, Garden Anywhere. And what a perfect fit for our show.
Yeah, and you'll hear more about the book and lots from Tara later in the show. And if you want to connect with us, you can find Dad at stephenbiggs.ca, and you can find me at emmabiggs.ca. And make sure, again, send us an email at instudio101@gmail.com.
Now, you can also find us on Instagram. We hang out as the Garage Gardeners. And if you're tomato crazy, be sure to visit Emma on Instagram, where she hangs out as @EmmaBiggs_grows. @EmmaBiggs_grows. Now, our first guest today, Tara Nolan, will give us ideas for pushing garden boundaries with raised beds. Raised beds can be a great way to get an early start in the spring. The soil heats up more quickly than beds at grade. Now, in my own backyard, things get pretty wet in the spring. The previous owner of my house told me that there used to be a seasonal water course at the back of the lot, and every spring water moved across the back of the lots on our block, moving towards the east. Now, I installed a veggie garden near the back of the lot, and in adding compost and amendments, I ended up with raised beds, about 6 inches higher than grade. It never occurred to me that my newly raised beds would act like a dike, preventing the water from draining through my property onto the next. The rest of my yard was particularly soggy that spring. Didn't take me long to reconfigure the beds so that the following year the water could drain across the property. Now, our guest in the second half of the show today, Andrew Barney, joins us from northern Colorado, where he's using backyard plant breeding to push his garden boundaries.
Yeah, and so we're going to be talking to Tara, and we're also going to be we're going to be playing our pre-recorded segment with Andrew Barney in the Tomato Talk segment. And it's going to go over stuff about blue tomatoes, which has been my passion recently. Tomatoes with blue shoulders. I think it's just the coolest thing ever. And so Andrew is interested in unusual tomatoes like me. And then for Dad's Bigs on Figs segment, he's going to talk to Tom and Trish from Dancing Bear Farm in Massachusetts. And like Dad, it sounds like the amount of space that they give their fig trees just keeps growing.
Now, remember, send us an email. We're giving away a fantastic book today, Raised Bed Revolution, by our first guest, Tara Nolan.
Now, Tara is a garden writer, author, editor, and speaker here in Southern Ontario, and she's also a co-founder of the award-winning gardening website Savvy Gardening, which is savvygardening.com. And Tara's book is Raised Bed Revolution, Build It, Fill It, Plant It, Garden Anywhere. and so Tara, it was also the award-winning web editor of the Canadian Gardening Magazine's website for 6 years. But most importantly, Tara is a garden writing friend who's taught us so much about garden writing, and we love seeing her at events every spring, and so we're really excited to talk to her. You can find her at savvygardening.com. By the way, she's also in a collaboration. That's part of a collaboration between her, Nikki Jabor, and Jessica Walliser. And on Instagram, you can find them at Savvy Gardening, and on Facebook and Pinterest too. And you can also find her as Tara_E on Instagram. Now, let's chat with Tara. Hi, Tara.
Hi.
So we're really excited to be talking about raised bed gardening today, and it's something that we've started doing a bit of in our backyard. So I want to know how you got into it.
Well, when I moved to Dundas, I actually used to live in Toronto, but when I moved to Dundas just over 7 years ago, I inherited that typical in-ground veggie garden, sort of relegated to a corner of the yard. And it was a bit hard-packed and misshapen. And so really, originally, I wanted to just put raised beds in to sort of elevate the area aesthetically. I wanted it to just pretty it up a little bit. But then I quickly discovered all these wonderful benefits of gardening in raised beds. So I started with 2, and now of course, my collection, especially with the book, has expanded. But those first 2 raised beds really started to teach me a lot about the benefits of gardening in an elevated garden.
And so what are the benefits of gardening in a raised bed?
There are so many. You mentioned one of them about the soil warming up sooner in the spring, which is what I'm always really eager for. I keep going out there because I have garlic, and it's quite behind this year. So I keep going out and pulling the straw aside just to see what's underneath there. And one of the great ways, or the great things about raised bed gardening is that for accessibility, it can raise the bed up to whatever height you need it to be. So if you have problems bending down or kneeling in the garden, you can bring the raised bed up to waist height if you really want to, or you can just have it, at a sort of standard height.
Yeah, and something I've seen that was really cool, I'm just thinking, was a wheelchair raised bed. So someone in a wheelchair can get near a raised bed to garden.
Yes, and I think, that's so wonderful because, it can just absolutely open up the joy of gardening to everybody. And I discovered a couple of enabling gardens in my research as well, where they've created gardens for people with both physical and cognitive disabilities, and you can roll a walker and a wheelchair easily among the garden beds, and they're all at different heights as well. So I think accessibility is a big benefit to raised bed gardening for sure.
Okay. So can you tell us a bit about your own raised beds? Because I guess there's so many different ways you can build a raised bed and so many different designs. I'm kind of curious to hear about the different ones that you have.
Yeah, so my first 2 were just those standard 4x8 raised beds that we put in. My husband actually built them when I went away for a weekend, so I came home and they were in the yard, which was really exciting.
That's a nice surprise.
Pardon?
That's a nice surprise.
It was a very nice surprise, and so we promptly filled them with soil and got gardening. And then I built, there's one with a raised bed with benches that I really like because I can sit out there with a cup of tea, I can perch on the edge and easily weed the raised bed. It's a little bit higher, which is really nice because I have this sudden bunny issue in my yard that I didn't have when I first moved in. There's 3 resident rabbits, and they get into the lower raised beds as well as the squirrels and the raccoons, of course. But so that higher raised bed is nice because they can't get in that one.
And what would the height difference be?
Pardon?
What would the height difference be to solve the rabbit problem? How high do you think that one is?
That one's about 3 feet, I would say.
3 feet, okay.
3 feet, yeah. And it's nice because, the squirrels still jump into anything, so it's hard to keep them out unless you put some sort of physical barrier. But that one definitely keeps the groundhog and the bunnies out of it, which is nice. I also have a groundhog. I think I have one of everything and 3 bunnies. So, and the deer find them too, but not till the winter usually. So that's okay. I usually have some kale and some other things hanging out that they like to eat. But at that point, I don't mind so much.
Okay. I cut you off. You were telling us about your different raised beds, too.
Oh, no problem. So I have another one, and actually when you were mentioning about the water issue, that's one sort of tip that I have when I give my talks, because I put this raised bed in full sun, but it's also in a bit of a wet spot. I live almost under the Niagara Escarpment, and so the houses that go towards the escarpment are all raised up from me, and so the water does have a natural way of going through different parts of the property. And unfortunately, I didn't really think about that when I put in one of my raised beds, so it gets a lot wetter and drains slower than my other raised beds. So that's one thing that people should be mindful of is where you put your raised bed when you're installing it in the yard.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking we have, as Dad said, a really wet backyard, so maybe we should just get all raised beds and maybe we can kind of fix that. Hint, hint, Dad, I'm going to go away on vacation and I can come back to a whole bunch of raised beds.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just had an email come in from Riley, and she's wondering about the basic procedure to make a raised bed, whether she should just use the garden soil on the sides and bottom. And maybe we could use that as a segue into some raised bed building tips.
Absolutely. So are you looking for the size as well, the standard? Because I always say that the typical raised bed size, raised beds can be any size, but the typical one is 3 to 4 feet wide by 6 to 8 feet long and 10 to 12 inches high. And the reason for that is it allows you to reach easily into the raised bed without having to actually step in it for the most part.
Okay.
That's
such a big...
Pardon?
That's such a big thing. I've made raised beds too wide in the past, and I know I hurt my back trying to weed the middle.
Yes, because you don't want to step in them, because that's another benefit of the raised beds is that the soil doesn't become hard packed because you're not walking among the rows and sort of inadvertently, hard packing the soil that's around the plant. So it's nice to be able to reach in easily to do whatever, to plant or to weed or to get into the soil. So that's definitely one of my big tips. And one thing I do wish I had done with my first 2 raised beds, the wood is perfectly intact. I use untreated cedar for all of my wooden raised beds, but I do wish I had put a midpoint stake along the length, because the raised beds are starting to heave a little bit with the freeze thaw that we get.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of my tips as well.
And when you say a midpoint stake, does that just anchor those beams so that they don't warp outwards? Is that what that is?
Exactly. And so it's just a thinner piece of wood, or you can use a 2x4 even, whatever you have on hand. It just kind of keeps things a little bit more rigid along the long lengths of the raised bed. And so you can nail them to the outside. Some people actually will put rebar or dowel on the inside of their raised beds just to hold that long point a lot sturdier.
Okay.
We just had a question come in by email from Shane, and he's asking whether raised beds can be used for any type of gardening, so vegetables, fruit, flowers, etc.
Absolutely. I've had great success planting both. So I plant a lot of edibles, but I also plant a lot of flowers, especially flowers that I can cut for vases. It's nice to have fresh bouquets throughout the summer. One thing I do recommend is that you read the seed packet carefully, because I got very excited one year after Canada Blooms. I bought Pastel Dreams zinnias, which are a beautiful variety, but they grow to be about 3 to 4 feet tall. So I had them at the front of my raised beds thinking, they'll be a very pretty little border along the edge. And of course they shaded out everything behind. But the pollinators love them. The hummingbirds come to them, the butterflies and bees. So it's really nice to mix food and flowers, and there's mutual benefits to having both in the gardens as well.
Okay.
Awesome. And for anyone else who wants to email in questions, it's instudio101@gmail.com, and we're talking to Tara Nolan. So, Tara, I also wanted to ask about some of the memorable raised beds that you've seen that other people have built.
That's right. And what comes to mind is the suitcase planter that you have in your book. I just absolutely love that.
So I have a lot of fun at antique markets. It's kind of fun to see what you can upcycle into something new and into something you can grow food and flowers in. And the suitcase was one of my finds at the Aberfoyle Antique Market, which isn't too far from where I live. And I drilled holes in the bottom of it and took the lid off. And then I had a builder that helped with a lot of the bigger raised bed projects, because he's a lot faster at the woodworking aspect of things than I am. So his name's Scott McKinnon, and he creates furniture for indoors using those gas pipe legs. And so with the suitcase planter, I thought it would be really fun to do that outside as well. They do rust in the rain, so you might want to coat them in Tremclad or something, just in case you don't want any of the rust spilling over onto your patio. But it looks really neat outside. I usually have it in my front. I have this sort of small patio area in my front yard, or I guess beside my front door. It's kind of a weird, unused space. So I usually put it there and grow quite a bit in it.
Okay. And besides the suitcase, what are some of the other things that you've upcycled into planters, raised beds?
I think one of my most popular projects is the lettuce table that I built. I took an old, small antique dining table and I converted it into a lettuce garden, essentially. And really, it was quite easy because the top was already loose on it, and I took it off, and it provides this nice sort of shallow area because lettuce doesn't really need a very deep growing area. And so I used hardware cloth just to create a bit of a basket at the bottom and secured it with some cedar strips and just put landscape fabric in, and started growing lettuce and other really fun greens like amaranth and pea shoots and that sort of thing.
And so when you say it was fairly shallow, how deep a raised bed would that have been?
That one's about 4 inches. It's funny because I saw a really neat IKEA table that I thought I could convert, but it was 2.5, which is a bit too shallow because the water does drain out pretty quickly. So it would just be a little bit too shallow for that. But I'd say 3.5, 4 inches, you're okay with lettuce seeds.
Hey, Dad, I think we have to go and look for some tables.
Yeah, some antique
grow
shopping.
More lettuce. Yeah.
What other, when it comes to making beds, we were talking about the length and width. Some other ideas for people when it comes to planning their beds. What other pointers do you have?
You definitely want to make sure that your raised bed gets those 6 to 8 hours of sunlight for the heat levers like tomatoes and peppers. My sister down the street, she is on a corner lot, and she gets sun way beyond the typical 8 hours a day because she's sort of south facing, and it just moves around that one part of her property and grows monstrous vegetables. So I'm always really jealous of some of her plants because mine are regular size, but hers just love the spot that they're in. So just pick that sunniest spot of your property to put your raised bed, even if it's the corner of a driveway or the back of your deck. Try to capture as much of that sunlight in your garden as possible.
Okay. And are you doing raised bed gardening in areas that are less sunny, and are there things that you grow in that kind of situation?
Well, to be honest, actually, those first 2 raised beds that I put in, because I live on a ravine, the tree canopy's actually grown quite a bit since I moved in. And so those beds tend to get a bit more shade now than they did when I first moved here. And so I'll plant things that don't mind a little bit more shade, like greens and peas and some of my root vegetables. They can usually survive in those beds. They still get sun, but they just get a little bit more of that dappled shade than I would like in the afternoon. So I've moved some of the heat levers to other raised beds that I have on the property because they just get more full-on sun throughout the day.
Okay.
Tara, could you do you have anyone that comes to your mind of any neat raised bed gardeners that have done something really neat?
I've met so many interesting gardeners over the last few years. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention Nikki Jabor, who's on the East Coast. She's got I think 18 to 20 some odd raised bed garden in her Halifax area property.
Yeah.
And she makes hers from hemlock. And now she has this polytunnel that she's been planting in. So I'm a little jealous of that because
I've been
able
jealous.
to plant some things much sooner.
I've seen that too, and I'm incredibly jealous.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We just had a question come in from Shelley in Toronto, who's wondering, Tara, if you'll be doing any speaking engagements in Toronto this summer. She'd love to see you speak.
Oh, I think I just did one recently at a garden club at the Toronto Botanical Garden, and I think that actually is all for Toronto area for this year, but I'm in Orangeville and East Gwillimbury and Brooklyn and Alliston in April. They might be a little bit of a drive, but those are the garden clubs that I'm speaking at in the next month. Oh, I'm also at Lee Valley Tools on the 13th. It's a Saturday, and that's the Burlington location, and I'll be doing a raised bed talk there as well in the afternoon at 1.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
I have my calendar right here, so.
What about some other, a couple other interesting raised bed gardeners who you've met as you've talked about this subject so much?
When I was researching the book, I met a really interesting woman in Toronto named Joanne. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I think it's Doust or Dust. And she has created this whole rooftop of sub-irrigated planters, which is a whole other discussion, but they are essentially raised beds. They're like those self-watering planters, but she makes them all herself. And she grows a lot on her rooftop. So I was really inspired by what she's done in her property to grow different edibles.
Yeah, I've seen that garden, and it's spectacular. And I remember her saying that she doesn't have a doorway to this rooftop. She climbs out a bathroom window. And she said that her husband just rolls his eyes when she's carrying bags of soil up the stairs inside the house.
I know, it's amazing. It's a really cool setup. And, you know, if that's where you've got the light and the sun, and of course she would have had to make sure that everything was structurally sound underneath. But if you have that space, then, you know, you might as well put it to use.
Let's keep talking about interesting raised beds. And what are some of the other beds that you've seen? Maybe any other upcycling ones? You described the table and the suitcase ones that you've made, but in your travels and photo shoots for this subject, what else have you seen that's really different?
Well, one of the I was introduced to fabric raised beds, actually, which are made from post-consumer recycled materials. And that was a few years ago now when I went to a Garden Writers Conference in Quebec City, and they were growing edibles all throughout the city in these fabric raised beds. And so I've started gardening them in them as well, and had great success growing things like potatoes and tomatoes and peppers. And last year I had a big one that had a smaller watermelon variety in it. So I think those are really, really neat and worthwhile for gardeners to take a look at, because they're not upcycling them themselves, but they have technically been upcycled from recycled materials.
Yes, okay. What about soil? Do you have a favorite soil that you've found that works really well in your raised beds?
I do get a lot of questions about soil. When I built all of the raised beds for the book, I had a lot to fill. And so I had to call for a delivery. And there's a place near me called the Dirt Depot, and I ordered what I thought was the best vegetable triple mix that I could put in the gardens that they had. But what I did also was I top dressed all of my raised beds with a few inches of compost. And that is one of my tips that I usually give to people when I do my talks, is that if they don't have a compost pile, that you keep maybe a couple of bags on reserve for the season. Because if you're succession planting, for example, when you're pulling your pea plants out, say at the beginning of the summer, and getting rid of things in the garden and wanting to plant more, if you add some more compost back in, you're adding some nutrients back into that soil. And I'm kind of forgetful when it comes to fertilizing, so that's my way of adding nutrients back in on a more regular basis when I'm succession planting and about to plant something different.
Okay. Now I was wondering about irrigation. Have you seen any neat irrigation ideas to do with raised bed gardening?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't totally hear you.
I was just wondering about irrigation for raised bed gardening.
Yes, irrigation is something that you can set up a kit afterwards, but when you have everything pulled apart and you're building your raised bed and you haven't put your pathways and everything back in yet, that's a great time to think about irrigation before all the plants go in. And that's also maybe the opportunity to dig a hose maybe under a pathway or something like that. So there's lots of really great kits now that you can get. They do require a bit of math if you're putting your own together, but there's lots of great tutorials that you can find to put a bigger irrigation system into your raised beds. There's also just really neat smaller ones that you can get. That I saw one actually by the same distributor as the fabric pots that I found, and they are just a spike with a water bottle. So you can get some smaller scale irrigation in your gardens as well. And my poor parents who have to water when I go away over the summer. I'm sure they would appreciate if I had full-on irrigation systems in my raised beds, because they're wandering around with the watering can or the hose.
Yeah. Now, I was also just wondering about raised beds to push garden boundaries, because I remember we were at Durham College, and it's near us, and they had raised beds, but then they had a cover over top to extend the season, and so that they could plant in them and grow in them longer. So I was just wondering whether you've seen any other season extension ideas for raised beds.
Well, I created a cold frame as one of my projects using an old window. And I do caution against some of the old windows because they were very brittle. And my sister, who lives down the street, she created one for just to cover one of her raised beds to extend the season. And I think she dropped it about an inch and it shattered. So you do want to make sure that if you're upcycling windows, just to kind of make sure that they're, as much as you can, that they're sound. But that's a way to even convert an existing smaller raised bed into a cold frame if you want, and you could get an early start or a later season on your raised beds with those.
Okay. Me and Dad have been planning to do something like that recently on our raised beds, so we're excited, and I've been bugging him to get that done.
Yeah.
The pressure's on.
Pardon?
The pressure is on.
Absolutely, yes. We have a lot of building to do, it sounds like.
We just had an email come in from Susan, and she's wondering about a website. So, Susan, you can go to savvygardening.com to find out more about Tara's projects, her advice on raised beds, and other gardening advice, too. So that's savvygardening.com. Well, Tara, we're almost at the point where we need to finish up, but are there any last raised bed tips that we didn't ask you about, but we should have?
Let me think. You had talked a bit about season extension and about pushing your zones, and so I was trying to think of something that I grew that was pushing my zone, because I think I'm 6A, 6B-ish, but I'm also kind of pushing 7 a little bit in spots. So I do want to try growing Camellia sinensis. That's sort of up on my radar. I found some seeds through Richter's, and see if I can grow tea. That's my next idea. And I do grow lemongrass in my raised beds, and that's one of my tips even for smaller containers is, people will use a dracaena or a spike to add that height to an ornamental raised bed, but I use lemongrass because it's edible. So that's sort of one of my food tips for raised beds. And of course I have a fig tree that I got a little wee twig from you a few years ago at the RBG when you did a fig talk, Stephen. And so his name's Wilbur, and Wilbur is doing very well in his raised bed on wheels, which I wheel into the garage and then bring him into the cold area for him to go dormant over the winter.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that Wilbur's doing well. That's good. And the lemongrass, what a great idea. Lemongrass instead of dracaena.
Yeah, I put it in. I dry it for tea, and I put it in curry in the fall, and I'll throw it in the crock pot with a bunch of chicken and all my spices, and it's so fragrant and lovely. So it's just kind of fun it's not very expensive to buy at the grocery store, but it's something that's just really fun to grow myself.
It sounds like, Dad, we're going to be growing lots of lemongrass and making lots of tea.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're getting to the time where we need to finish up, but thank you for all the amazing information that you've shared with us. And Dad, the pressure's on for more raised beds and cold frames. So thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great chatting with the both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Tara.
Bye.
Bye.
That was garden writer, author, editor, and speaker Tara Nolan. And you can check out Tara's amazing book, Raised Bed Revolution. You'll find out, you can find it at bookstores, and you can find more of Tara's work at savvygardening.com. And on Instagram and Twitter, you can find her at the handle @savvygardening. And on Facebook and Pinterest, it's @savvy_gardening. Well, with that, I think we're going to head into the second half of the show. And Emma.
Yeah, well, I have to point out one more thing, too. If you're interested in Tara's book, email us in your questions, your comments, your ideas, and you may be eligible to win a copy of the book. And it's definitely a book that you must have in your gardening collection.
Okay. Well, our exciting news is that Emma's new book, Gardening with Emma, is out. And it's a kid-to-kid guide on growing cool plants and healthy food. We think it's inspiring lots of young people. Emma gave a talk at Toronto Botanical Garden recently where she shared her ideas for kid-themed gardens. And we had a message the next day from a mum who said it inspired her kid to plant a dragon-themed garden, which was really exciting for us. And so Emma came up with some different names that had dragon in them, like dragon's egg cucumber and red dragon arugula. And it was just a great experience.
Oh, it was such an amazing experience. And add on to that, we had the dragon tongue bean. And yeah, it was just amazing.
You're listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show, where we talk about extending the gardening season, pushing zone boundaries, and how to deal with garden zone envy. We talk to creative gardeners and garden experts who share ideas about how to garden longer and grow plants you didn't think you could grow.
You're listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show. I'm Emma Biggs, and thanks for hanging out with us today. I'm 13 years old, I love extreme gardening and growing tomatoes, and I want the garden season to never end.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Biggs. I write and speak about the food chain, farms, food, and gardens, and I'm a fig pig. Emma and I think gardening's a great way to hang out together, and we're so glad you're hanging out with us today.
Now, Dad talks about figs in every episode, and another really fun crop that isn't too hard to grow in cold climates that many people think of is lemons. And so if you're interested in growing lemons, check out stephenbiggs.ca, where Dad talks about his new book, Grow Lemons Where You Think You Can't.
Now remember, we're giving away a fantastic book today, which is Tara Nolan's book, Raised Bed Revolution. Lots of ideas for a fantastic raised bed, lots of great information. So send in an email for a chance to win. Now, our next guest today is Andrew Barney, and he pushes garden boundaries by breeding unique and adapted vegetables in his garden in northern Colorado. Andrew bred a red-potted snap pea that we're excited to be trying in our garden this year. And another one of his projects is a watermelon landrace project.
And so it's so great to see backyard gardeners pushing so many garden boundaries. And it's cool because Andrew actually works in robotics, although he told us that he's going back to school in the fall to study plant breeding at Colorado State University.
So you can check out Andrew's blog, which is keen101 at wordpress.com. And that's where he shares lots of neat projects. As well as plants and genetics, he writes about electronics and Esperanto. Andrew's website is biolumo, so that's biolumo.com. We pre-recorded this chat with Andrew, so now here is Andrew telling us about his plant breeding projects. I have on the line with me today Andrew Barney, who's in Colorado, and he's growing in a colder climate. And Andrew has had a lot of fun pushing crop boundaries and growing things where they're not supposed to grow, one of which is Teosinte. And Andrew, welcome to the show. Thanks for talking to us today.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm really interested to know more about how you got into Teosinte, because it's not a crop that we hear about every day.
No, it really isn't. Really, I guess it goes back to how I got introduced to gardening and growing odd things in general. So when I first started growing, I'm trying to think when it was, maybe around 2010, I had an old Thanksgiving decoration, from corn decoration. Mm-hmm. And it had some really wild colored seeds on it. Some of them were striped in various colors. And it was starting to fall apart, and rather than throw it out, I decided to try planting them and see if they grew. And so I did that, and they grew into normal corn plants, and so I was just surprised at that. But as the season progressed and I was watering them, all of the corn plants were green, average, except for one. One was deep dark purple. The leaves were purple. Everything was purple about it, and it just stood out so brightly to me that I was shocked. And I had never heard of that. And I tried Googling on the internet for this, and I couldn't find any pictures. I couldn't find any information about it. And so that's how I kind of got into just gardening in general. And so, bouncing off that, I was really interested in, trying to keep growing my corn, especially the purple corn. And I learned that scientists had this theory about where corn came from, and it was this ancient plant, this ancient grass from Mexico called Teosinte or Teosinte, however it's pronounced. And it's very different from modern corn or modern maize. Yeah, so that's how I got into it.
Well, so tell us about that, because maybe so our listeners can visualize it. How would you describe it compared to modern corn?
Okay, so the plants themselves are nearly identical. They start out as kind of this, little grass that pops out of the ground, and as they grow, they get bigger. They have a nice large stalk. Most of the Teosinte plants, they tiller heavily, so instead of having one big stalk like modern corn is, and you have a couple ears coming off of it, Teosinte likes to branch out, and it's like a clump of grass, and it's huge. But the actual fruiting is normal. It's almost the same. It's like a small cob of corn, or at least the husk anyway. But when you break into the husk, there's not an actual cob. It's this really weird, tiny little tower of seeds. And the seeds themselves aren't shaped like corn. They're kind of like a trapezoid shape almost.
I saw the pictures on your blog, yeah.
Yeah, so there's these trapezoids, and each seed is stacked on top of each other. And it's very interesting because it's so different from what you think of that's sold at the grocery store.
Now, have you connected with other people who are growing Teosinte?
I have a little bit here and there. I think one of the first people I connected with was Joseph Tykonovich, and he's actually written a plant breeding book. But we had connected because he had been trying to grow some Teosinte, and so he had pictures on his blog. He was one of the first people that I had talked about. And then one of my collaborators that I collaborate with a bunch of different projects with, his name is Joseph Lofthouse from Utah, and he was trying to grow things like Teosinte and watermelon that, they don't grow well in his climate either. And him and I have kind of collaborated specifically on the Teosinte. Yeah, we've been able to find a variety that we're able to get seeds year after year now. And it took quite a while because, the plants would grow, they'd start to flower and set seed, and then the snow would hit and they would die.
So for the harvest then, how does the harvest work with Teosinte?
We finally got some to save seed, and that was really the biggest challenge with it in our climate. But really, I kind of do it like a flint corn or an Indian corn, where I try to just bring the plant maybe into the garage and let it dry down naturally. And once it's dry, you can break off the seeds and pull them out, and they just kind of break apart easily. Yeah, then you can just store them that way.
I was just curious, is it any good for eating, like modern-day corn?
That's a great question. So I guess there are places in Mexico where some tribes still grow it, and they collect it. They can grind it into flour and use it like corn flour. But then my collaborator Joseph, he actually decided to do an experiment one day, and he said, "I wonder if this will pop like popcorn." And so he put it in like a microwave or a corn popper, and they popped, and they look just like popcorn. They're just a little bit smaller.
Cool.
Wow.
So yeah, they're perfectly edible. Yeah.
We want to know too about some of your work with watermelon and peas, and maybe start with the peas because we're excited about the color that you have in the peas. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so a lot of my projects are around peas right now because they're fairly easy to grow, but I've been amazed at the variation that's in peas. I grew up in school in science class. They talked about Gregor Mendel, and his discovery of genetics. And so I had thought that, Gregor Mendel had discovered all the genes there were to, discover. And I thought, oh, peas are probably boring. But I discovered there was this woman in England, Rebsy Fairholm, and she had discovered a new cross where there are purple peas out there. And I was amazed to find out just that there's purple pods instead of the green ones. And then there are yellow pods, and those are really cool if you grow them just by themselves. But apparently if you cross yellow and purple, eventually you can get ones that come out with red pods.
Wow.
And so that's one of the projects I've been working on quite a while, is trying to get a really good red podded pea. Yeah.
Because we grew purple peas last year and yellow peas and white peas, and I think actually you sent us seeds for the red peas, and so I'm so excited. I'm like, red peas? Wow.
Yeah, so I hope they turn out well for you. I'm still working on it, so it's a project in process. I think they could totally be improved, but we'll see if you get something cool from those seeds.
Now, what about watermelons? You've been working on watermelons too, Andrew.
I have. And so that project, again, comes back to, my friend Joseph in Utah, and you really should try and get him on the show and talk to him, because he really has some interesting projects. But he had a project where he started some cantaloupes, and he couldn't grow them at all in his mountain valley, and he just kept trying it. Year after year he had failure, and then one day he got some that grew, and he just kept planting them, and now he produces them amazingly. And I wanted to replicate that with watermelon. I love watermelon as a fruit, but, in the United States at least, they're traditionally grown in the hot, humid South. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of in a dry northern high mountain Colorado.
Right.
So it's not a place normally known for growing watermelon, but I've been working on it, and I've been starting to have success with that.
Okay. That makes me think that there's a variety that my son Keaton grew last year called Cream of Saskatchewan, and certainly I don't associate Saskatchewan with melon growing, but this is a smaller melon that matures more quickly, and it has a white flesh. It's a beautiful one.
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah, and I've heard good reviews on that one.
Well, before we finish off, I did want to ask you too about persimmons, because here in Toronto I've seen a couple of persimmon trees, the American persimmon, and I've tried myself, and I have to say I killed it, or it died. I don't know which. But
you probably killed it, Dad.
I probably killed it. Yeah, but you have one there, and you're in a 5A, I think, right? A zone 5A.
I am. I believe I'm in a zone 5A. So that's a new project that I just embarked on. But I actually ordered 4 persimmon trees, and instead of going for the American, I decided to go for the Asian, just because I think they taste a little better. But again, it's kind of a gamble, because I'm pushing the boundary here a little bit. I don't know of anyone that has persimmon trees where I'm at, but I figured I'd give it a shot and see what happens. And that strategy has always paid off for me, because sometimes it fails miserably, but because I'm the only one trying these crazy projects, half the time I feel like I have success. And so persimmons, just planted them, I think, a year ago, or maybe 2 now, but out of the 4, 1 died, didn't make it through the winter. Then the 3 came up. They came up later than I expected. They might have died back down to the root. I'm not sure, but they did come back, and I'm waiting to see if they come back another winter, another year, because it is possible that maybe they just lucked out the 1 year and they're going to die the second year, but we'll have to wait and see on them.
Certainly, you need patience in what you're doing, and it sounds like you have it.
I have a decent amount. Sometimes I get impatient. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, thanks very much for chatting with us today and telling us about how you're pushing the boundaries there and growing unusual crops and crops that people expect to grow in warmer climates.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, and thank you for pushing the envelope up there in Ontario. I've actually been to Toronto once, and I love the area. It's a beautiful area.
I hope you get a chance to come up here, and then we can give you a garden tour.
Yeah, that would be great. Maybe next time I'm up there, I'll give you a call.
That would be great.
Yeah, so that was Northern Colorado gardener and the amazing backyard plant breeder, Andrew Barney, telling us about some of the fascinating backyard breeding work that he was doing with things such as Teosinte and watermelon. And so if you want to know more about that, and if you also want to know more about what's coming up next in my tomato segment about some blue tomatoes and neat tomato varieties, you can check out his blog, which is keen101 at wordpress.com. That's KEEN 101 at wordpress.com. And so now we're moving into my tomato talk segment, and I'm excited because we get to talk about my favorite plant. And so you're going to hear another chat that we had with Andrew, and it's about tomatoes. And so we're excited to hear more about blue tomatoes and some of the unusual varieties that he grows. So here's my chat with Andrew. So thanks for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk about blue tomatoes. And so last year, well, I think 2 years ago was the first time I actually grew a blue tomato. And it was this tomato variety that was called Great White Blues. And it was a big beefsteak tomato. And the top of it was blue and the bottom was white. It was the most magnificent tomato I'd ever seen. And so I'm really curious more about blue tomatoes and the AF gene. And I've grown more tomatoes since then. And I'm excited to know more about them.
I haven't grown, every blue tomato out there. So I've only grown a handful myself, but I do know a little bit about the genetics, and I'm really excited about them because I really like fruits and vegetables that stand out, visually, and it's almost a bonus if they taste good too.
Yeah, I can totally agree with you. Yeah, so I wanted to know a bit about the AF gene. I was reading one of your blog posts about it. So could you tell our listeners what that is?
Yeah, so from the research I've done, there's a couple different genes that have gone into the modern blue tomato that has been released. The first tomato I was introduced to was bred by Oregon State University, and the line that I was reading about on the internet was called P20, and I guess it had kind of escaped from their lab, before they were ready for it too. Someone had shared some seeds, and they weren't quite ready for its release, but then they released a variety called Indigo Rose, and that was basically the same as P20.
Okay.
By Dr. Jim Myers. But the AF gene, specifically, from what I know about it, is a dominant gene that produces anthocyanins. Yeah, that's the blue coloring that you see in a lot of fruits and vegetables.
Okay.
And that will produce blue coloring on the skin of the fruit.
Okay.
And just the skin, as far as I know.
Yeah, because thinking about it now, I've grown maybe 5 or 6 blue tomatoes now, but I've never actually seen one with blue on the inside. They've all only had blue skin. Now I have to ask, because I'm planning my garden for this year, I need to know what your favorite blue tomato is, or if you can choose one.
That's a tough one. There's one that stands out visually, and I believe it tasted decent, called Lucid Gem.
Okay.
And that was one of those ones bred by Brad Gates from Wild Boar Farms.
I actually ordered the seeds for that this year, and I'm so excited. I can't wait.
Okay. Another one close to that stood out was Dark Galaxy. I don't know if you've tried that one.
I actually grew that last year. I loved it. I thought it looked so cool. And so that one, it was like a mix of darker colors, like a brownie and bluey. It was pretty neat.
Yeah. So the Lucid Gem is cool because it's kind of got that blue color on the outside and almost an orange yellow on the inside.
Well, I'm so excited to grow that one, and I love blue tomatoes. But I also wanted to ask you a bit about your wild tomato breeding project and what you're working on with that.
Oh, that's fun. So that one's kind of a multi-person project around the world. It's kind of unofficial at this point, but a bunch of us are trying to work together basically to breed better tomatoes for our climate. And I'm here in Colorado in the U.S., and it's an interesting climate because it's mild enough that I can grow a lot of things, but it's harsh enough that certain types of plants don't want to grow like they grow in other areas.
Okay.
And so it can be a challenge for some things and really easy for other things. And tomatoes for me have been sort of a challenge because I don't want to spend a lot of effort improving my soil with, really rich soil that costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
I kind of just want to plant them and have them grow. And some of my soil's a little clayey and dry. We have a dry climate here.
Okay.
And sometimes it's difficult.
And so you're trying to breed tomatoes that are more cold tolerant and do better in colder climate?
Mm-hmm. Some of it, yeah. So some of it is cold tolerance, and hopefully the ability to plant them earlier, have them produce, later in the season when other tomatoes might die off.
Okay.
Things like that. But another part of that is like breeding them to be a little more drought tolerant. Grow in soil that the average domestic tomato doesn't grow well in. So that's kind of what I'm shooting for.
Okay.
And other people are shooting for like disease resistance as well.
Well, I know I probably shouldn't complain because we're in Toronto and the weather's not fantastic, but I totally love a tomato that would produce earlier and longer, and so I'm totally with you to keep that project up. Now, I have another question for you about the Galapagos tomatoes. Now, it's plural because there, I guess, are two types. Am I right?
Yeah, there actually are.
Could you tell me a little bit about the two different types? Because I'm curious, because they have the same name, how they're different.
Yeah, so originally, the research that I've read about is originally they were classified as the same species, and one was just classified as a subtype.
Okay.
And then I don't know how recent it was, maybe 5-10 years ago, they were able to reevaluate them, and they determined that they actually were two different species, although very highly related.
Okay.
And so the new names that they have now are, I believe they're pronounced Solanum cheesmanii and Solanum galapagense.
Okay. Well, it was awesome talking to you, and I'm so excited. I want to read more about the AF gene, about the blue tomatoes now, and I'm curious. I want to help out with the wild tomato breeding project now, and I'm so excited. So thank you, Andrew, for talking to me.
Yeah, thank you, Emma.
Yeah, I know you've got lots of our listeners excited about the upcoming tomato season.
Thank you. Yeah, I could talk for hours.
And I definitely could talk for hours too. And that was Andrew Barney talking with me about blue tomatoes and the Galapagos tomatoes. And I definitely could have talked for hours. And so if you want to check out his blog, again, it's keen101@wordpress.com.
And Andrew is gardening in northern Colorado, and he's involved in a wild tomato breeding project. Now, we're moving into the part of the show where I get to look at growing figs in cold climates, and today you'll hear my chat with Trish Crapo and Tom Ashley at Dancing Bear Farm in Leiden, Massachusetts. And they got into figs by accident about a decade ago. Now they sell fresh figs at farmers markets and sell fig trees to other cold climate gardeners. When we chatted for this interview, they told me that their fig trees, which are in a greenhouse, are all leafed out and forming fruit. And I have to tell you, I'm jealous. Mine are all dormant and in the garage or in the yard under straw mulch. You can find Tom and Trish at dancingbearfarm.com. Now, here is my chat with Trish and Tom. Okay, I have on the line with me Tom and Trish from Dancing Bear Farm, and they are going to tell me their story about growing figs and how they got into figs. So, Tom and Trish, maybe let's start out. Can you tell us a little bit about Dancing Bear Farm?
Sure. We started in 1981. actually is a small garden in Vermont. Shortly thereafter, we moved to Leiden, Massachusetts, right on the Vermont border, and had more land and started farming on a larger scale. Produce, for the most part, selling to farmers markets and local grocery stores.
Okay.
We dabbled with some animals, pigs and cows, and did that for quite a few years, and then decided we should probably have kids instead.
Also, yes, maybe. Lot to take care of. Everything needed doing at overlapping times. You needed to hay right when you needed to plant tomato seeds in the greenhouse, and it was a lot to try to juggle.
Yes. Okay. Well, now, where did your fig odyssey begin, or how did it begin?
Well, that's a wonderful story. 10 years ago now, one of our very good customers, she was a customer since we started. She loves fresh produce. She brought me 4 dead sticks from her family fig tree in Brooklyn, New York, and said, stick these in the greenhouse and see what happens. And at that point, I had never had a fresh fig. I knew what a fig was, but fig Newton was really my only experience with figs.
Okay.
And, so, I messed around with them for a while, and finally cleaning up the greenhouse, I said, okay, I'll stick them in the ground. Sure. And not knowing anything about what was going to happen. And now, 10 years later, we have constructed a big, huge greenhouse over the old one. I've got 6 trees planted in the ground, hundreds and hundreds of potted trees that we've moved through, and thousands of mature, ripe figs picked over the years.
Wow.
Yeah,
so,
they have taken over my life.
Good. I'm glad I'm not the only
Careful.
one. Now, Trish, had you tasted figs before? Because Tom said he had only had the fig Newtons. How about you?
I don't think I had ever had a fresh fig. You know how there's certain things like I think it took me a long time as a kid to understand that a raisin was a dried grape.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you just think of them as a certain thing, and I think I always just thought of figs as dried. I think I had dried figs. Like my mom used to like to make curry, and she'd chop up dried figs on top or whatever. But no, I remember when we first had the fresh figs, it was a curious flavor, right? We were surprised by it because there's all that greenness, the green kind of, and I mean green in a wonderful way. There's like a unexpected. How would you explain that flavor, Tom?
Complex.
Yeah. Because there's the sweetness of the inside, but then if you eat the skin, not everybody does, I guess. But dude, that's a really light, green, refreshing kind of
cucumbery, melony.
Yeah.
And what about your customers who had not eaten figs before? What reaction have you had from them?
Oh, a lot of people have eaten figs. They had more experience than I had when I went to farmer's market and first had first I sold the fig trees, and then when the figs started producing enough, I started selling the figs. And they're an immediate attention grabber at the farmer's market in Boston, say, or around here to have fresh figs. Anybody who had a fig knew what they were in for and appreciated being able to have them.
And we're sort of nostalgic and really, really happy to see them sometimes. And the Italian customers that you had.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been wonderful. The people that appreciate figs and have found us through the internet, or I'm not sure how.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about that, the meeting other people in the fig community. Have you found figs have connected you and made a bit of a community for yourselves?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's they're just great people. It was similar to we did heirloom tomatoes early on, and another thing is garlic. We grow a lot of garlic, and people are passionate about those things. So they're happy to see that you have garlic or figs or tomatoes. It's nice to share with people.
Okay. So before we finish off, one last question. Is your fig collection growing all the time? Is it getting bigger? Do you always need more space for it?
Well, the greenhouse is a finite space. It's 30 by 60. So it will hold, I figure, 10 mature trees. As far as my potted collection, that takes up less space. It goes outside for the seasons. And I have another greenhouse which may be taken over by figs.
Yeah, right now the other greenhouse he grows peppers.
Still grow peppers.
In these raised beds, beautiful, like frying peppers. Cherry tomatoes right in the ground. But I can definitely foresee a time when the figs kind of take over that.
Oh, I love it. Well, Trish, Tom, thank you for talking to me about figs, and I love your enthusiasm and your passion for them.
Yeah.
Well, and thank you.
Thank you
for doing this.
I love your book and your daughter's book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, that was Dad talking with Trish and Tom at Dancing Bear Farm. And, Dad could talk forever, but they told Dad that the fig trees are taking over, and we definitely have that same problem at our place. You should see our garage right now.
You can find Tom and Trish at dancingbearfarm.com. And by the way, Tom will be speaking about figs at the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference in Manchester, New Hampshire. The conference runs from December 10th through the 12th, 2019. Now, the Garage Gardeners radio show is just about over for today, but before we finish up, we have a draw for a book. And Emma has pulled a name from the hat, and the winner is Riley. So, Riley, you win a copy of Tara's fabulous book, Raised Bed Revolution, and what we'll get you to do is send another email back into the station with your information, with your address, so that we can get that book sent out to you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you've all enjoyed the show, and thanks to our guests for sharing their knowledge.
Yeah, and so you can find us again on Instagram as The Garage Gardeners, and me under the name EmmaBiggs_grows, and find the podcast later on Apple Podcasts. And we'd love to meet you in 2019, so you can check out what the talks that me and Dad are doing on our website, StephenBiggs.ca and EmmaBiggs.ca. And you're listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show. I'm Emma Biggs.
And I'm Stephen Biggs.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Garage Gardeners Radio Show with your hosts, Emma and Stephen Biggs, right here on Reality Radio 101.